What if I told you that the voices some hear in the void are not a sign of a broken brain, but echoes of a language we have forgotten? What if the delusions of persecution or divinity are not glitches in the matrix of reason, but the raw, desperate eruption of primordial myths that lie dormant in us all? Modern psychiatry has given us a comfortable map for the mind, a map that labels the unknown as illness, as disorder. But Carl Jung dared to navigate beyond the borders of that map. He descended into the abyss and returned with a dangerous revelation. Psychosis is not the end of the journey. It is the violent call to the true beginning. It is the soul's feverish attempt to heal a wound that consciousness refuses to see, using the only language it has left, the language of gods and demons. What you are about to witness is not a psychology lecture. It is the handing over of a key, the key that opens the cell where we have locked the most terrifying and, paradoxically, the most powerful parts of ourselves. This journey is not for the faint of heart, but for those who feel, in the depths of their souls, that there is a deeper truth hidden beneath the veil of our fragile reality. If this initial spark has already ignited something in you, if you have felt a shiver of recognition, then know that it was no accident. For this journey to transform you, I need you to make a pact now. Subscribe to this channel, not as a spectator, but as an explorer. Your subscription is your first step into the labyrinth. Leave a like, not for the algorithm, but as a signal of light, an affirmation that you are here, present and ready to face whatever comes. And finally, go down to the comments and answer this question with a single word that will define your intention on this journey. Have you come to build a bridge to the unknown, or to dive into the abyss? Your choice will set the tone for all that follows. Do it now. We are born into a world that teaches us, from our first breath, to build walls. The first wall separates the self from the other. The second, the safe from the dangerous. The highest and most guarded of all, however, is the one we erect between reason and madness. This wall, made of logic, social consensus, and daily routines, gives us the illusion of a secure castle, a citadel of consciousness lit by a sun that never sets. Within its limits, we feel like masters of our destiny, captains of our soul. We firmly believe that the ground beneath our feet is solid, that the laws of reality are immutable, and that chaos is something that happens out there, to others. We live our lives decorating the rooms of this castle, never daring to look at what stirs in the dark moats that surround it or at the infinite, nocturnal ocean that stretches beyond its ramparts. That ocean is the unconscious, and psychosis, my dear explorer, is the terrifying sound of a tsunami rising in that ocean. A tsunami generated by tectonic forces in the soul, poised not just to breach, but to pulverize the walls of your castle. Jung did not see this event as an act of pure destruction, but as a cosmic correction, a violent intervention by the psychic nature against the arrogance of an ego that has forgotten. It is just a small island and not the entire continent. The psychotic eruption is the moment when the veil of consensual reality is torn, exposing the individual, raw and unfiltered, to the reality of the psyche. It is the naked, overwhelming, and terrible truth that we are not in control. It is the discovery that we are inhabited by forces, archetypes, and energies that are much older, more powerful, and vaster than our small, diurnal consciousness. It is a direct confrontation with the numinous, the sacred, and the terrifying, without the protective mediation of rituals, religion, or myths, which serve as safe channels for this energy. The psychotic is, therefore, a drowned mystic. He is having a spiritual experience of immense magnitude, but he lacks both the cultural container and the resilient ego to navigate these waters. He is not someone whose brain has failed. He is someone whose soul has burst the limits imposed upon it, in a desperate search for a larger space in which to exist. It is the cry of a prisoner who, in trying to blow open the cell door, ends up demolishing the entire prison, finding himself lost and naked under a starry and indifferent sky. The modern world's reaction to this cataclysmic event is, in itself, a manifestation of fear. Faced with the overwhelming mystery of the psyche, conventional psychiatry has erected its own fortress, not of stone, but of terminology. It has created a lexicon of pathologization, symptom, disorder, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. Each word is a brick in the wall that seeks to contain the ocean, to categorize it, and ultimately, to neutralize it. The diagnosis becomes a sentence. It takes the most profoundly human and terrifying experience, that of losing one's very self, and strips it of all meaning. The individual ceases to be a traveler in a dangerous inner landscape and becomes a patient, an object of study, a set of deviant behaviors to be corrected. Their subjective experience, the terrifying richness of their symbols, the mythological narratives unfolding in their mind, all of this is relegated to the category of semantic noise, the product of faulty brain wiring. This approach, though born of an intention to help, commits a subtle but profound violence. It robs the sufferer of the dignity of their own journey. By saying you are sick, the implicit message is your experience is invalid, meaningless, an error to be erased. Medication, then, becomes the primary tool. It does not seek to understand the tsunami, but rather to drug the watchman in the tower so that he does not notice the approaching wave. It numbs, silences, lowers the voltage of the psychic experience, forcing the individual back within the confines of consensual reality. Sometimes this is necessary for survival, a tourniquet to stop a psychic hemorrhage. But a tourniquet is not a cure. Leaving the tourniquet on forever means the limb will necrose. By suppressing the symptoms, we often suppress the psyche's very attempt to heal. It's like turning off the fever warning light on the car's dashboard without asking why the engine is overheating. Jung warns us that this fortress of psychiatry, with its diagnoses and pharmacology, creates a spiritual desert. It offers security at the cost of the soul. It teaches us to fear our own interior, to treat our unconscious as an enemy to be conquered, and not as the source of our own renewal. True healing cannot come from suppression, but from integration. And to integrate, one must first have the courage to listen to what the chaos has to say. However terrifying its voice may be, why would the psyche resort to such a drastic and destructive measure? Why flood the small island of consciousness with a deluge that threatens to drown everything? Jung's answer is as beautiful as it is terrible, because the island was dying of thirst. Psychosis is not a random event. It is the climax of a long process of dissociation. Imagine a life lived one-sidedly, a life where only logic, the social persona, and external expectations are nurtured, while the inner life feelings, intuition, creativity, the shadow is systematically ignored, repressed, starved. The psyche, as a whole, seeks balance. It is a law of nature. When one side of the scale is overloaded for too long, a compensatory force of equal magnitude builds up on the opposite side. In the darkness of the unconscious, the pre-psychotic individual is often someone who has lived a life that is too normal, too rational, or, conversely, someone who has suffered a trauma so profound that the ego was forced to shield itself, to disconnect from vast parts of itself in order to survive. In both cases, an unbearable tension is created between the conscious and the unconscious. The soul, the totality of the psyche, begins to suffocate. The scream of psychosis is the scream of this suffocated part. It is the revolt of the forgotten territories. The unconscious, in its primordial wisdom, perceives that the ego has become a tyrant, a pharaoh who enslaves and ignores the needs of the people. The flood, then, is a revolution, a desperate attempt to overthrow the tyrannical regime and restore justice and balance in the inner kingdom. The content that emerges with the force of a volcano, the overwhelming emotions, the archetypal images, the imperative voices is precisely the material that was most violently repressed. If a person has repressed their aggression, their unconscious may manifest as persecutory demons. If they have repressed their spirituality, a messiah complex may emerge. The nature of the symptom is, in fact, a map that points directly to the wound, to the part of life that was not lived. It is the psyche's attempt to force the ego to confront the totality of itself, including the parts it considers unacceptable, terrifying, or inferior. It is a radical surgical intervention, performed without anesthesia. The psyche prefers the risk of total annihilation to a life of falsehood and fragmentation. It prefers death and the possibility of rebirth to a living dead existence, confined in a prison of sterile normality. Psychosis is, therefore, an act of profound, albeit chaotic, loyalty to itself. It is wild nature reclaiming its territory. To see psychosis as an attempt at healing requires a radical shift in perspective, similar to how we understand fever in the body. The fever is not the disease. It is the immune system's response to the disease. It is the body raising its temperature to create an inhospitable environment for invaders and to accelerate the healing processes. A fever is uncomfortable, debilitating, and if too high, dangerous. But it is a sign that the body is fighting. Likewise, psychosis is the fever of the soul. The chaos, the hallucinations, the delusions are the manifestation of a psychic system on high alert, mobilizing all its archaic resources to combat an infection, a one-sided life attitude, an autonomous complex, an unresolved trauma. What the outside world sees as madness is, from the psyche's point of view, an epic battle for survival and wholeness. The hidden wisdom here is that within the psychotic material lie the seeds of renewal. The flooding of the unconscious does not only bring monsters, it also washes ashore long-lost treasures, parts of the personality, talents, emotional and spiritual depths that were submerged may emerge during the crisis. Often, delusions contain a profound symbolic truth about the individual's existential situation. A man who believes he is a deposed king may be expressing the truth that his inner sovereign, his true self, has been dethroned by an inferiority complex or by external pressures. A woman who believes she is pregnant with a savior may be symbolizing the fact that a new principle of life, a new creative or spiritual attitude, is desperately trying to be born within her. The therapeutic work, in Jung's view, is not to correct these delusions, but to understand them. It is to ask, if this were a dream, what would its message be? What truth is your soul trying to communicate through this dramatic metaphor? It is to treat the psychotic content with the same respect one would give a sacred text or a great myth, because, in essence, that is exactly what it is, a personal myth, being lived out concretely and literally, because the ego has lost the ability to contain it. In the realm of the symbolic, madness is the soul's truth when there is no one left to listen to it in its own language, and the cure is not in silencing this truth, but in learning to translate it. When the ego, the small raft of consciousness, shatters, the individual does not fall into a meaningless void. They fall into the ocean of the collective unconscious, the deepest layer of the human psyche, a repository of all the ancestral experience of our species. And this ocean is not made of water, but of primordial images, of energetic patterns that Jung called archetypes. Archetypes are the invisible structures that shape our experience, the gods and demons that inhabit our inner pantheon, the hero, the great mother, the wise old man, the trickster, the shadow, the anima, the animus. In a healthy psyche, we interact with these forces through dreams, art, religion, and relationships. They influence us, but the ego maintains a safe distance. In psychosis, this distance collapses. The individual is no longer related to the archetype. They are possessed by it. The membrane between the personal and the collective dissolves. The man doesn't feel the need to save the world. He is the Messiah. The woman doesn't fight her fears. She is literally pursued by demons who follow her down the street. The language of psychosis is the mythological language in its rawest and most potent form. The bizarre ideas are, in fact, universal mythological themes. The paranoia of being watched by secret agencies is the modern manifestation of the myth, of the all-seeing eye of the gods or persecution by evil spirits. Feelings of bodily fragmentation echo the myths of the dismemberment of gods like Osiris or Dionysus, which are always followed by a rebirth. Auditory hallucinations, the voices, often take the form of dialogues with gods, angels, or demons, reflecting the archaic experience of man in direct communication with the divine or the infernal. Jung realized that to understand psychosis, one had to be a scholar of mythology, folklore, and comparative religion. He saw that his patients were not inventing nonsense, but were reenacting, in a tragic and solitary way, the great dramas of the human soul that, in other eras, were contained and experienced collectively through rituals and mysteries. The psychotic is a lone actor on a cosmic stage, forced to play all the roles of a divine drama without a script and without an audience. Their tragedy is the literalization of the symbolic. the inability to distinguish between the I and the archetypal thou. And the only way out of this theater of the absurd is to rebuild an ego strong enough to say to the God or the demon, I know who you are. You are a part of me, but I am not only you. Although the eruption of the unconscious is an attempt at healing, it is also an extremely dangerous journey. The greatest risk, besides social disintegration, is what Jung called inflation. Inflation occurs when the small ego, the personal consciousness, is flooded by an archetypal content of immense energy and identifies with it. Imagine a small fishing boat suddenly being equipped with the engine of an aircraft carrier. The disproportion is so great that the result can only be annihilation. When an archetype like that of the savior, the hero, or the wise old man erupts and the ego merges with it, the individual loses all sense of human proportion. They feel omnipotent, omniscient, imbued with a cosmic mission. They no longer have doubts, only divine certainties. They are the bearer of a truth that will change the world. This is what lies behind the God complex often observed in manic or psychotic states. It is the flight of Icarus. The individual, intoxicated by the proximity to the archetypal sun, flies to high. Their wax wings the fragile structure of their ego melt, and the fall into the sea of disintegration is inevitable. This inflation is a defense against the opposite and equally overwhelming feeling of annihilation and insignificance. In order not to feel like an absolute nothing, the ego clings to the fantasy of being everything. It is a violent oscillation between the poles of existence, God and worm. The danger of inflation is that it prevents true integration. Integration requires humility. It requires the ego to acknowledge the power of the unconscious, but without identifying with it. It requires the ability to dialogue with the inner figures, to honor them, while maintaining one's own autonomy. The inflated person does not dialogue, they proclaim. They do not learn, they know. Therefore, the healing journey from psychosis necessarily involves a painful process of deflation. One must accept one's own humanity, one's own limitations, one's own shadow. One must descend from Olympus and learn to walk on the earth again, with wounded but firm feet. The fall of Icarus is not just a tragedy, it is an essential lesson. True wisdom lies not in touching the sun, but in learning to fly at an altitude that respects both the power of the sky and the fragility of our wings. Without this lesson, the attempt to heal from psychosis transforms into its opposite, a gilded cage of grandiosity, as isolating and unreal as the cell of catatonic depression. If psychosis is a plunge into the mythological labyrinth of the psyche, the therapist cannot be a mere external observer, a scientist in a white coat analyzing a specimen. They must, metaphorically, enter the labyrinth alongside the patient. Their role is not to kill the minotaur, but to hold Ariadne's thread the human connection, the therapeutic relationship, so that the traveler does not get lost forever in the darkness. For Jung, the treatment of psychosis was less about technique and more about the therapist's attitude. It required immense courage to expose oneself to the other's chaos, to allow one's own psyche to resonate with the psychotic material without being swallowed by it. The therapist becomes a container. They offer a safe space, a psychic womb where the terror, fragmentation, and unbearable emotions of the patient can be held, felt, and slowly metabolized. They do not dismiss the delusions as absurdities, but listen to them as if they were the most important of communications. They validate the reality of the patient's subjective experience, even if they do not agree with its literal interpretation. The key phrase is not "that's not real," but "tell me more about it. What is it like to feel that way?" This attitude of deep respect and curiosity is, in itself, therapeutic. It communicates to the patient that they are not alone and that their experience, however bizarre it may seem, has potential meaning. The therapist becomes an auxiliary ego. When the patient's ego is in ruins, the therapist lends theirs, helping to organize the experience, to find patterns, to connect the symbols with the individual's life story. They function as a translator, helping the patient decipher the archaic language of their own soul. This process is slow, arduous, and full of setbacks. It demands of the therapist a solid connection to their own unconscious, a deep knowledge of mythology and symbolism, and, above all, a radical humility. They need to know that they do not have the answers, but that they can help the patient find them within themselves. The ultimate goal is not to cure psychosis in the sense of eliminating it, but to help the individual traverse it. It is to help them emerge on the other side, not necessarily unscathed, but transformed, with a broader consciousness, a more resilient personality, and a deeper, more respectful relationship with the vast powers of their inner world. Ariadne's thread does not eliminate the monster, but it ensures that there is a way back to the light of day. A common mistake when interpreting Jung's view is to think that he advocated for the dissolution of the ego in favor of the unconscious. Nothing could be further from the truth. For Jung, a strong, flexible, and well-anchored ego in reality was the sine qua non for any deep work, and especially for surviving and integrating a psychotic crisis. The ego is not the enemy. The enemy is a rigid, one-sided, weak, or inflated ego. Think again of the metaphor of the boat and the ocean. The goal of the journey is not to sink the boat and become one with the ocean. That would be psychotic annihilation. The goal is to build a better, stronger, more resilient boat, capable of navigating deep and stormy waters without shattering. A healthy ego functions as a mediator between the inner world, the unconscious, and the outer world. Consensual reality, it needs to be porous enough to allow creativity, intuition, and wisdom from the unconscious to flow into consciousness, but firm enough not to be flooded by them. It needs to have the ability to discriminate, to say no to both the irrational demands of the inner world and the overwhelming pressures of the outer world. The process of healing from psychosis is, in large part, the process of rebuilding this ego container, brick by brick. This involves very practical and earthly tasks. It involves re-establishing routines, taking care of the physical body, reconnecting with work and safe social relationships. It involves learning to anchor oneself in the present moment, to distinguish between inner fantasy and outer reality. The symbolic work and exploration of delusions can only happen safely if there is one foot firmly planted on the ground. This is why Jung was cautious. He knew that the descent into the unconscious was a dangerous path, not suitable for everyone and not to be undertaken lightly. A weak ego, in trying to confront the unconscious directly, would simply be shattered. The journey of integration, therefore, is a dialectical movement. It is a dive into the symbolic, followed by a return to the concrete. It is exploring the personal myth, but also learning to pay the bills and maintain healthy relationships. The strength of the ego lies not in its ability to repress the unconscious, but in its courage to relate to it. A truly strong ego is one that can admit its own smallness before the vastness of the psyche, one that can listen to the voices of the abyss without becoming one of them. It is an ego that serves not as a tyrant, but as a wise and humble steward of the vast and mysterious kingdom that is the human soul. The final phase of the journey, after the storm has passed and a new ego container has been formed, is that of reintegration. This is an alchemical process of transforming the lead of the psychotic experience into the gold of expanded consciousness. It is not about forgetting or erasing what happened, but about finding the right place for each fragment of the experience within a new and broader personality structure. The demons that once pursued the individual in the streets need to be recognized as parts of their own shadow and integrated. The aggression, fear, and lust, which manifested in a concrete and projected form, need to be brought inward, accepted, and placed at the service of life, transforming into assertiveness, caution, and passion. The divine figures with which the ego was inflated need to be returned to the inner pantheon. The individual learns to relate to the savior archetype within themselves, for example, not by becoming a messiah, but perhaps by engaging in helping work or expressing their creative gifts. The energy that once fueled grandiosity is channeled into a real and human purpose in the world. This process of reintegration is, in essence, the heart of what Jung called the individuation process. It is the path to becoming an individual, in the sense of indivisible, whole. The psychotic crisis, with all its pain and destruction, forces the individual to confront the parts of themselves that they had split off and denied. Healing happens when they can, slowly, gather these fragments. It is the work of stitching the soul back together. Every memory of the delusion, every voice, every vision, needs to be revisited, not to be relived, but to be understood in its symbolic context. What was that experience trying to teach me? What part of me was screaming to be heard? The final result is not a return to the previous normality. That old normality was the very cause of the illness. The result is the birth of a new, more complex, and more conscious personality. The person who emerges from psychosis and successfully integrates it is someone who has known the depths and heights of human experience. They develop a profound humility, a greater tolerance for ambiguity, and a connection to the transpersonal and spiritual layers of life. Psychosis leaves a scar, without a doubt, but as in the Japanese art of kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold, the psyche becomes stronger, more beautiful, and more precious precisely because it has been broken. In the end, we do not arrive at a conclusion, but at a perspective. The journey through psychosis, seen through the lens of Jung, reveals itself as one of the most dangerous and potentially most significant human experiences. It teaches us that sanity is not the absence of darkness, but the ability to integrate it. It shows us that the human soul cannot bear stagnation and falsehood, and that it will resort to the most extreme measures to force us to grow. He who has passed through the psychotic fire and returned is no longer the same. He carries the scar of the battle, and that scar is a symbol. It is a permanent reminder of the fragility of the ego and the immense power of the unconscious. It is a map of his own depths, a testament that he has faced his own monsters and survived. In a world that glorifies superficial happiness and aseptic normality, the scar is a mark of honor. It is proof of a life lived in its totality, with all its pain and all its glory. This person no longer fears the darkness, for they have already danced with it. They no longer fear chaos, for they have already seen a new world born from its ruins. They develop a compassion that is not theoretical, but visceral, forged in the fire of their own suffering. They understand that the line separating sanity from madness is not a concrete wall, but a thin, permeable membrane that exists in each of us. Jung's vision of psychosis is, ultimately, a call to courage. The courage to look at what we fear most, within ourselves and in others. The courage to seek meaning in the apparent meaninglessness. The courage to believe that, even in the darkest night of the soul, there is a hidden wisdom, an attempt at healing, a promise of a more conscious dawn. Psychosis is not a death sentence for the soul. It is a brutal and uncompromising invitation to a more authentic and complete life. It is the final proof that, to find the light, sometimes, one must have the courage to cross through the heart of darkness. The battle is not against the disease. The battle is, and always has been, for wholeness.